Under the August 30th headline, Nation's Hope Veil Lifts from Libya's History of Terrorism, the New York Times' John Burns pondered what he called a question being asked with new urgency. Quote, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's government in ruins, what reckoning is likely for the terrorist bombings that were once a signature of the former Libyan leader's war with the Western world? Close quote. Burns mentions Pan Am Flight 103, the most prominent example, and the 1986 Berlin nightclub bombing that killed 3 people, but he doesn't acknowledge serious questions about culpability raised in both attacks or cite earlier Times reporting, noting the context of the Berlin bombings as retaliation, quote, against the sinking of 2 Libyan boats by the United States in the Gulf of Sirte, close quote. Which isn't to say that Gaddafi was innocent of these charges, and his rule in Libya was certainly marked by vicious attacks and repression inside the country. What's difficult to imagine is someone at the Times writing about how nations have clamored with urgency, as many have, for accountability for terrorist acts supported, linked to, or committed by George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. It's not as if it would be difficult to point to their signature acts. Reagan's funding and support for death squads in Latin America, the massive aggressive war launched against Iraq, and the torture and prisoner deaths that occurred under Bush. But something tells us an analysis that applied similar standards to U.S. leaders as to official enemies would not be deemed news fit to print.
The media consensus is that the Libya war is basically over and that the White House deserves credit. In the September 5th issue of Time, Fareed Zakaria writes that a lesson was learned from the Iraq debacle, the need to gather a real international coalition. Zakaria recalls that the Bush administration skipped this, failing to give weapons inspectors more time and treating some opposition to the war as petty legalistic annoyances. But this is the same Fareed Zakaria who, back in the day, was writing that it was time to get on with the war in Iraq and stop this weapons inspecting business. Don't get me wrong, 2002, Zakaria wrote with confidence, quote, Iraq is surely producing weapons of mass destruction, close quote. The only problem is, quote, Iraq has become increasingly expert at dispersing and hiding these facilities, which are often small enough to fit into a bathroom or a van, close quote. Zakaria stressed that time was short. If the war didn't start quick enough, the pressure for action will dissipate and weather could delay an invasion. And he warned, quote, you cannot replay this movie, close quote. Well, if only. Zakaria is not the only one revisiting Iraq. On ABC's This Week, pundit George Will was annoyed that Dick Cheney's new book doesn't include an apology for going to war under false pretenses. Well, okay, but this is the same George Will who wrote that Colin Powell's WMD presentation at the UN in 2003 would, quote, change all minds open to evidence, close quote, and likened anyone who doubted WMD claims to a conspiracy theorist. Well, luckily for people like Will and Zakaria, damaged credibility isn't a concern. They'll still be considered A-list foreign affairs pundits as long as you forget what they wrote.